Good morning, and welcome to our worship service. I'm Donna Zimmerman, your worship leader today, and my pronouns are she and her. We are the Buckman Bridge Unitarian Universalist Church, or as we say, BBUUC. We are an exploring and learning faith with deep, strong roots that welcomes you to bring your diverse backgrounds to our church. We have no shared creed you must profess. However, we lovingly share this learning, growing faith journey with you. To find out more about our church and our many activities to stay connected, including classes for adults and youth, meetings, social gatherings, special events, and so much more, please visit our website, bbuuc.org. And to learn more about our denomination, go to uua.org. Please note, since today is Mother's Day, we will not have our usual fellowship hour at 11:30 this morning, so our members have extra time to celebrate the day. Happy Mother's Day to all who have nurtured others.
We light this chalice for mothers and mothering,
to celebrate those who have taken on the task of nurturing a baby, child, or youth into adulthood.
to celebrate those who have nurtured the light of truth and compassion, growing minds and hearts.
To celebrate those who have committed time, money, and energy to the growth of others in this world.
We light this chalice to celebrate and hold dear this flame of love.
This morning's reading are words adapted from Lisa Bovey Kemper. Mothering can be elusive or infuriating, fulfilling or confusing, commonplace or triumphant. It exists in the everyday experiences of each person. There is no human being that is not connected to or disconnected from a mother. And there is room for all in this circle. If you have carried a child or children, whether or not they came to be born, we see you. If you have fervently wished to do so, and circumstances of fate made it impossible, we see you. If you love children we cannot see, whether because of death or estrangement, we see you. If you never wanted to be a mother, we see you. If you are happy to mother other people's children as an educator, an aunt, a caregiver, or special friend, we see you. If your mother hurt you physically or emotionally, we see you. If you had no mother at all, we see you. If your mother is or was your best friend, we see you. If your gender says you are not a mother, and yet you take on the role of nurturer, we see you. If you wonder whether your mothering has been enough, we see you. And if yours is a different truth altogether, honor your unspoken story. There is room for all in this circle.
Enemy Pie by Derek Munson. Illustrated by Tara Callahan King. It should have been a perfect summer. My dad helped me build a treehouse in our backyard. My sister was at camp for 3 whole weeks, and I was on the best baseball team in town. It should have been a perfect summer, but it wasn't. It was all good until Jeremy Ross moved into the neighborhood, right next door to my best friend Stanley. I did not like Jeremy Ross. He laughed at me when he struck me out in a baseball game. He had a party on his trampoline and I wasn't even invited, but my best friend Stanley was. Jeremy Ross was the one and only person on my enemy list. I never even had an enemy list until he moved to the neighborhood, but as soon as he came along, I needed one. I hung it up in my treehouse, where Jeremy Ross was not allowed to go. Dad understood stuff like enemies. He told me that when he was my age, he had enemies too, but he knew a way to get rid of them. I asked him to tell me how. Tell you how? I'll show you how, he said. He pulled a really old recipe book off the kitchen shelf. Inside there was a worn-out scrap of paper with faded writing. Dad held it up and squinted at it. Enemy pie, he said, satisfied. You may be wondering what exactly is in enemy pie. I was wondering too, but Dad said the recipe was so secret he couldn't even tell me. I decided it must be magic. I begged him to tell me something, anything. I will tell you this, he said. Enemy pie is the fastest known way to get rid of enemies. Now, of course, this got my mind working. What kinds of things, disgusting things, would I put into a pie for an enemy? I brought Dad some weeds from the garden, but he just shook his head. I brought him earthworms and rocks, but he didn't think he'd need those. I gave him the gum I'd been chewing on all morning. He gave it right back to me. I went out to play alone. I shot baskets until the ball got stuck on the roof. I threw a boomerang that never came back to me, and all the while I listened to the sounds of my dad chopping and stirring and blending the ingredients of enemy pie. This could be a great summer after all. Enemy pie was going to be awful. I tried to imagine how horrible it must smell, or worse yet, what it would look like. But when I was in the backyard looking for ladybugs, I smelled something really, really good. And as far as I could tell, it was coming from our kitchen. I was a bit confused. I went in to ask Dad what was wrong. Enemy pie shouldn't smell this good. But Dad was smart. If enemy pie smelled bad, your enemy would never eat it, he said. I could tell he'd made enemy pie before. The buzzer rang, and Dad put on the oven mitts and pulled the pie out of the oven. It looked like plain old pie. It looked good enough to eat. I was catching on. But still, I wasn't really sure how this enemy pie worked. What exactly did it do to enemies? Maybe it made their hair fall out or their breath stinky. Maybe it made bullies cry. I asked Dad, but he was no help. He wouldn't tell me a thing. But while the pie cooled, he filled me in on my job. He talked quietly. There is one part of enemy pie that I can't do. In order for it to work, you need to spend a day with your enemy. Even worse, you have to be nice to him. It's not easy, but that's the only way that enemy pie can work. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Of course I was. It sounded horrible. It was scary, but it was worth a try. All I had to do was spend one day with Jeremy Ross, and then he would be out of my hair for the rest of my life. I rode my bike to his house and knocked on his door. When Jeremy opened the door, he seemed surprised. He stood on the other side of the screen door and looked at me, waiting for me to say something. I was nervous. Can you play? I asked. He looked confused. I'll go ask my mom, he said. He came back with his shoes in his hand. His mom walked around the corner to say hello. You boys stay out of trouble, she said, smiling. We rode bikes for a while and played on the trampoline. Then we made some water balloons and threw them at kids in the neighborhood, but we missed. Jeremy's mom made us lunch, and after lunch we went over to my house. It was strange, but I was kind of having fun with my enemy. He almost seemed nice. But of course I couldn't tell Dad that, since he had worked so hard to make this enemy pie. Jeremy Ross liked my basketball hoop. He said he wished he had a basketball hoop, but they didn't have room for one. I let him win a game, to be nice. Jeremy Ross knew how to throw a boomerang. He threw it and it came right back to him. I threw it and it went over my house and into the backyard. When we climbed over the fence to find it, the first thing Jeremy noticed was my treehouse. Now, my treehouse was my treehouse. I was the boss. If my sister wanted in, I didn't have to let her. If my dad wanted in, I didn't have to let him. And if Jeremy wanted in, can we go in it? He asked. I knew he was going to ask me that. But he was the top person, the only person on my enemy list, and enemies are not allowed in my treehouse. But he did teach me how to throw a boomerang. And he did have me over for lunch, and he did let me play on his trampoline. He wasn't being a very good enemy. Okay, I said, but hold on. I climbed up ahead of him and tore the enemy list off the wall. I had a checkerboard and some cards in the treehouse, and we played games until Dad called us down for dinner. We pretended we didn't hear him. When he came out to get us, we tried to hide from him, but somehow he found us. Dad made us macaroni and cheese for dinner, my favorite. It was Jeremy's favorite, too. Maybe Jeremy Ross wasn't so bad after all. I was beginning to think that maybe we should just forget about the enemy pie. But sure enough, after dinner, Dad brought out the pie. I watched as he cut the pie into 8 thick slices. Dad, I said, it sure is nice having a new friend in the neighborhood. I was trying to get his attention and trying to tell him that Jeremy Ross was no longer my enemy. But Dad only smiled and nodded. I think he thought I was just pretending. Dad dished up 3 plates side by side with big pieces of pie and giant scoops of ice cream. He passed one to me and one to Jeremy. Wow, Jeremy said, looking at the pie. My dad never makes pies like this. It was at this point that I panicked. I did not want Jeremy to eat enemy pie. He was my friend. I couldn't let him eat it. Jeremy, don't eat it. It's bad pie. I think it's poisonous or something. Jeremy's fork stopped before reaching his mouth. He crumbled his eyebrows and looked at me funny. I felt relieved. I had saved his life. I was a hero. If it's so bad, Jeremy asked, then why has your dad already eaten half of it? I turned to look at my dad. Sure enough, he was eating enemy pie. Good stuff, he mumbled through a mouthful. And that was all he said. I sat there watching them eat enemy pie for a few seconds. Dad was laughing, Jeremy was happily eating, and neither of them was losing any hair. It seemed safe enough, so I took a tiny taste. Enemy pie was delicious. After dessert, Jeremy rode his bike home, but not before inviting me over to play on his trampoline in the morning. He said he'd teach me how to flip. As for enemy pie, I still don't know how to make it. I still wonder if enemies really do hate it, or if their hair falls out, or their breath turns bad. But I don't know if I'll ever get an answer, because I just lost my best enemy.
We may be separated in person, but we are still connected in our hearts and spirits. As a church community, we support each other in troubles and we celebrate in happiness. That's what friends do. And physical distance is immaterial when you are connected at the heart. We light candles for this week's milestones with a happy birthday to Lucy W. on May 12th and another birthday celebration for Rune K. on the 13th. In addition to her birthday, we wish to light another candle for Lucy W., who is recovering from oral surgery last week. We hope she has a smooth recovery. And we light a candle for Myrna K.'s daughter, Tracy, who is undergoing chemotherapy for gallbladder cancer. We send her lots of love and our positive thoughts for strength and success in her treatments. This candle of joy is for Donna Z., who completed her 6-month chaplain internship at Baptist Hospital and graduated last Wednesday. And a final candle for those unspoken joys and concerns that live in the sanctuary of our hearts. I invite you to listen to the words of Reese Leva. Remember, woman, you were born life giver, miracle creator, and magic maker. You were born with the heart of 1,000 mothers, open and fearless and sweet. You were born with the fire of queens and conquerors, a warrior's blood you bleed. You were born with the wisdom of sages and shamans, no wound can you not heal. You were born the teller of your own tale, before none should you kneel. You were born with an immeasurable soul, reaching out past infinity. You were born to desire with passion, abandon, and to name your own destiny. Remember, woman, remember, you are more than you can see. Remember, woman, remember, you are loved, endlessly. Remember, woman, your power and grace, the depth of your deep sea heart. Never forget you are woman divine, as you have been from the start. Thank you for your faithful pledge commitments, which support our church and the mission of the congregation. We know your giving comes from sacrifice and hard work, and we pledge to honor your giving by ensuring the funds are wisely spent and they do a greater good when gathered together than they could have done alone. Speaking of wise spending, the board and Reverend Amy are pleased to announce the kickoff of our capital campaign, Paying It Forward Beyond Mortgage to Mission. Our goal is to do an early payoff of all loans, including our mortgage, no later than November 1st of this year. To do this, we need just under $113,000, and a generous anonymous gift of $50,000 in matching funds will go a long way in making that happen. Check out our website for details. Now, let's make this happen. Our Share the Plate donations for May will support the organization Rethreaded. Their mission is to provide a second chance for survivors of human trafficking locally and globally. They do this through employment in different parts of the company, which includes learning job skills in every aspect of working in a business for those survivors. Please use the Rethreaded donate line on our YouTube channel, or you can make a direct donation through the donate button at rethreaded.com. Thank you for your support in this important cause. We are pleased to have Reverend Kimberley Debus in our pulpit today. She is a fellowshipped UU community minister based in upstate New York, inspiring an artful and art-filled faith. She consults with congregations and religious professionals throughout the denomination. She has previously served at the Church of the Larger Fellowship, as well as congregations on Long Island and Key West. The pulpit is yours, Reverend Kimberley.
I bet many of you grew up watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, or showed it to your children as they were growing up. I was born at just the right time. I was 4 when it first appeared on our local PBS station, the perfect age for this unique show. And paired with Sesame Street, which came out at the same time, this little white girl from the northernmost of the Taconic Mountains in upstate New York was suddenly learning about towns and cities, counting and spelling in English and Spanish, learning what other people looked like, what it meant to use our imagination, what it meant to be a neighbor. I was reminded of the powerful ministry of this gentle Presbyterian minister from Pittsburgh when I watched the documentary Won't You Be My Neighbor that came out a few years ago. And it struck me how important it was to hear those messages in the wake of the King assassination, in the midst of the Vietnam War, in the restlessness of the country, things that I as a small child knew nothing about, except things always seemed wrong and some of my schoolmates' dads never came home. I don't think it's a mistake that this documentary and the 2019 film A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood with Tom Hanks resonates so deeply. The lessons that Mr. Rogers was teaching us and is still teaching us help ground us when we feel utterly ungrounded. They are there for the taking. These things that Unitarian minister Robert Fulgham reminded us we learned in kindergarten. How to be kind and how to share. How to forgive. And how to take care of ourselves and each other. And we need these reminders. Too often I fear we get so caught up in the hustle and bustle, and lately the existential anxiety and very real sustained stress and trauma, that we forget to pay attention to others. We forget that while we are the lead characters in our own stories, we are but bit players and maybe just background extras in the stories of other people. So it's no wonder that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood continues to be so important. The ministry of Rogers focused on teaching children and adults how to live out the assertion that we have inherent worth and dignity just by being human, and how we are all worth care and consideration. And while I don't know this for a fact, Rogers' faithful Christianity leads me to suspect that the grounding for at least some of those lessons might come from a sometimes difficult but ultimately helpful text from the letter to the Ephesians. Now I say difficult because the writer uses the metaphor of marriage to explain his point, and here's where that pesky "wives be subject to your husbands" thing shows up. I know. But what the writer is really getting at, and states at the beginning and end of this passage, is simply this: be subject to one another. Now, for those not familiar with the biblical text, this epistle or letter to the church at Ephesus is one of many written in the name of Paul of Tarsus, carrying on this ministry of someone who planted these Jesus churches around the Mediterranean. By this time, Paul had this collection of churches he planted and stewards, much like our congregational or regional consultants do. And, well, let's not kid ourselves. People 2,000 years ago were pretty much like people today. And any time you get a bunch of people collected in any kind of organization, eventually there will be moments of unrest and misbehavior, especially when they're collected around a mission or a vision or a belief. And so looking at these epistles, I realize that they aren't so much sacred text as swift kicks in their collective keisters. Over and over again, Paul is telling them to remember what holds you together. Stop with the holier-than-thou attitude because you have found something meaningful, and really just stop being bad. This one to the Ephesians is no different. My hunch is that there was a lot of conflict and infighting there, so this letter is very much reminding everyone to get along with one another, especially since the figure they're centering their organization around, Jesus, is most assuredly not keen on people treating one another with disrespect. In other words, this whole idea isn't so much about a particular belief or connection to a particular God. It's about you and it's about me, which means it's about us. What we are talking about is seeing one another as this big family of humanity, as the people we devote our last measure of affection to. It's how we are seen and cared for and thought of. This passage, this idea is calling us back to our best selves. It's about how we treat one another, the people we have known for months or years or decades, the people we work side by side with on committees and events and projects, the people we celebrate and mourn with, the people who delight us and annoy us and whom we consider family, the people whom we see, care for, and think of, and hope to receive the same from in return. Now, I know, people don't always get along well all the time, especially when there are decades of history. I remember meeting some longtime members of a congregation I once served. In one afternoon, I was to meet Dorothy, who had been a member for about 40 years, and then later with Caroline, who had been a member for about 40 years. Both women had served as president on various committees, taught religious education. They'd done it all. In my conversation with Dorothy, I learned about the 7-year span that she and Caroline hadn't talked to one another because Caroline had done something unforgivable. But as time wore on, they kind of forgot about it, and while they still argue a lot and talk about each other a lot, well, at least they're talking again. A few hours later, I learned from Caroline about how she and Dorothy hadn't talked for about 7 years because Dorothy had done something unforgivable, but at some point they forgot about it, and, well, while they still argue a lot, they are mostly talking again and mostly not talking trash about each other. My point, and I do have one, is that many of us have similar stories. And we sometimes speak without thinking because, well, these people know me and I can say anything around them and it doesn't matter. But it does. And the way we treat each other and speak to each other can cause long-held grudges and hard rifts. We assume there's a level of trust, forgetting that trust needs to be constantly built and tended. I wonder if Caroline and Dorothy could have avoided the 7-year silence if they thought about how they were seeing each other, speaking to each other, and being subject to each other. Maybe they'd realized what had happened and made an effort to call one another back into covenant. I wonder what happens when we do. This stuff matters because if we don't get it right inside our walls, in our communities, we have no hope of getting it right out in the world. Because being subject to one another, yes, is about family and friends and fellow members of the congregation, but it's also about those outside our immediate scope. Right now, it's about the care we're showing others by protecting ourselves and protecting others in order to stop the spread of the virus. This is how we treat strangers. This is about how we treat one another with our policies and our laws. This is how we affirm and promote justice, equity, and compassion. Now I want to pause to be clear about something. Being subject to one another is not about being subservient, as some might want to interpret that Ephesians text. This is not about an imbalance of power. It shouldn't be. Rather, it's about attention, being attentive to one another, supporting one another, aware of one another, being kind to one another. And kindness makes a difference. I'm not talking about being nice. Nice is wishy-washy. It rolls over. It doesn't want to offend. Nice is complacent. Nice says comfort is more important than goodness, that ease is more valued than doing what's right. Blech. But kindness, now kindness is strong and active. Kindness sees a need and offers to help. In this time of pandemic, kindness wears masks and gets vaccinated. Kindness speaks up and speaks out. Kindness makes sure everyone's taken care of and included and valued. Kindness is an act of justice, whether building ramps or protesting police brutality or changing classist policies or calling for land and water protections or any of the many other things we do to affirm and promote all of us in this interdependent web as sacred and worthy. And kindness means sometimes shifting how we do things. It calls us to shed perfectionism, welcome new ideas as a gift, not a challenge, to embrace complexity, to embrace discomfort on the way to something better, to take responsibility, to truly listen and value each other's experiences, to be thoughtful and caring in our words and actions, to take time with what we say and do. We are called to be kind. Kindness is how we live into covenant with one another, how we act as Fred Rogers taught us to act, how the writer of Ephesians wants us to act. You see, there's a reason for that marriage metaphor for being subject to one another. Because he's not just talking about affection for others, but understanding that when all is said and done, we're all part of one family, one body, interconnected, bound to one another. And when we begin to understand that, we let go of our rugged individualism and embrace care as the organizing principle of society. Care that is creative and tenacious, relentless and wholesome, abundant and kind. The kind of fierce love that helped us survive the pain, loss, and heartbreak of 2020, where this love is the uncompromising foundation of our society. Here is where it starts. Here, with love, kindness, care, covenant, when we all come together, all seeking the same things and supporting one another and making room for mistakes and learning and growing into harmony together, being truly in covenant with one another, being subject to one another. It starts here, in this covenanted community. We have to get it right, or we stay small and ineffective partners in drawing the circle of love wide. We are subject to one another when we stop building walls and start building bridges. We are subject to one another when we work for equal rights and equal pay and safety and clean water and accessibility for everyone. We are subject to one another when we join our forces for good together. Remembering Margaret Mead's words to never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world, for indeed it's the only thing that ever has. Be subject to one another, pleads the writer of Ephesians, and Mr. Rogers, and every religious path worth its salt, and our commitment to covenant as Unitarian Universalists, which is a promise to be subject to one another, to be kind to one another, to hear one another, and to forgive one another. We know this stuff. We learned it as children, and it's what drew us to the life-saving message of Unitarian Universalism in the first place. We just need to remember, to notice each other's needs and seize the moment to act, to be willing to be uncomfortable in service to something greater than ourselves, to give of ourselves out of love and care and compassion, to be truly kind to one another, to think before we speak, and to speak with openness and generosity, to answer the call of our principles and our morals and our ethics and our faith. Let us be subject to one another.
Please listen to the words from the Skagit UU Fellowship. We extinguish this flame, a mere wisp of matter in process, almost as insubstantial as the thought of it. Yet our civilization has harnessed the power of such a flame to drive and shape a new world. So may it be with the power of our thoughts, that in truth and love, they may drive and shape a new world and a new us.
Let us close with this thought from Mr. Rogers. The only thing that really changes the world is when somebody gets the idea that love can abound and be shared. So share love. Be subject to one another. May this be our covenant. Go in love, go in joy, go in peace.